Kate Mila Falcha, welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. This is video number 2 of our book In Plain Sight by Ross Coulthart. And I want to get started because we have a lot of ground to cover. I hope you're enjoying this. I'm enjoying it enormously. Chapter 4, a worldwide phenomenon. UFOs were seen over sensitive defense sites, nuclear facilities, Air Force bases, etc. They buzzed aircraft all over the globe. The Kremlin debunked all of it, but Soviet pilots reported it and their reports were suppressed. In 1955, U.S. Senator Richard Russell was on a visit to the USSR on a train in the Trans-Caucasus, looked out the window and saw a UFO disc ascend vertically and slowly from somewhere on the ground. And at 6,000 feet, it suddenly just sped off at an alarming speed. He and his staffer then saw a second one. And this one was triangle-shaped. Staff on the train were panic-stricken. They kept trying to close the curtains and told them all, don't look outside. The story, he wrote it in a top-secret memo, and it was found by a Freedom of Information Act request 30 years later. The fear was that it was some top-secret Soviet military project designed by captured Nazi scientists. Because if you remember, at the end of the war, America and Russia divided up the Nazi scientists. This included all areas of science, but especially weapons, nuclear stuff, engineers, that kind of thing. They cherry-picked who they wanted. The Americans put theirs to work. For example, Wernher von Braun was a big old Nazi, and he became in charge of NASA, designed the whole rocket, aerospace industry, basically. Stalin cherry-picked what he wanted, and then he just shot the rest of them because they were, surplus, not smart enough, I don't know. So, many of these things were also seen in England. Hang on here. One event was described by the physicist who investigated it as one of the strangest and most disturbing radar visual UFO episodes on record. On 13th of August 1956, the radar operators at the Suffolk NATO base RAF Bentwaters, known to be armed with nuclear weapons, which became famous in Left at East Gate, another good book. They tracked an object soaring towards them at speeds of up to 9,000 miles an hour. A cluster of a dozen objects suddenly appeared on radar to the southeast of the base, with 3 objects leading the formation tracking northeast in a triangular configuration. The objects all converged into one huge target, sitting stationary in the sky for a quarter of an hour. RAF Bentwaters alerted the nearby RAF Lakenheath base, and staff on the ground there saw a luminous object stationary in the sky, which then zoomed off at unbelievable high speed. The British Royal Air Force scrambled a fighter jet to intercept the object. The pilot later described locking his radar fire control system onto the clearest target that I have ever seen on radar, quote. Only for the object to immediately disappear and reappear behind him. The encounter was classified until it was reported in the University of Colorado's UAP investigation project known as the Condon Committee in 1969. A physicist who investigated the British sighting for Condon, Gordon Thayer, declared that the apparently rational, intelligent behavior of the UFO suggests a mechanical device of unknown origin as the most probable explanation of this sighting. A U.S. Air Force investigator described the sightings as real and not figments of the imagination because 3 radar sets picked up the targets simultaneously. Okay then. Cables from 1956 to the U.S. Air Force attaché were sent, and cables to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the United States. And Wright-Patterson is prominent in all this UFO stuff. A UFO landed in Afghanistan after many radar sightings. they described a saucer. And because of the political situation, the Soviets were closer, and they beat the Americans to the place where it happened to investigate. But there's a U.S. Air Force cable confirming the recovery of a large flying disc in Afghanistan. No details. Similar sightings were in Australia in the 40s and the 50s near military sites. England used remote parts of Australia for their weapons tests, and he's Australia, he says thank you very much. And they had nuclear research also going on in Australia, and sightings began frequently over these sensitive sites. Anglo-Australian long-range weapons establishment was used to develop nuclear deterrence. They had an area of this facility called the Woomera Rocket Range, far outside Adelaide. This is the largest land-based test range in the Western world and extremely top secret. You probably never heard of it. I've never heard of it. They said the strange object was sighted over it dozens of times in May of 1954. A security officer saw an object in the path of a jet. I mean, this thing popped up in the front of a jet coming at it. A bomber. And it was 3 times as fast as the jet. It stopped in front of the jet's path in midair. It was circular, gray, and translucent. This has been corroborated by a sergeant, corroborated by radar. It was moving at 15,000 yards a second. It was seen by 2 women on a beach, too. It was obviously superior technology, and it was breaching secure airspace. Exclamation point. An earlier report of 5 eyewitnesses saw a cigar-shaped object over the test site, far faster than jets, as reported by multiple witnesses, and this was never explained. Ross says he's not sure there's a conspiracy of silence. He says it's a decision to ignore the elephant in the room to protect their careers. So this may not have been them putting their heads together and saying, let's keep quiet. Although I don't know, an awful lot of people were told don't say anything. But was the motivation, you want to get a promotion, you want to keep your job, you want to get your pension, shut your mouth. Not because otherwise there'll be repercussions from us, but you'll make yourself look and you'll be gone over for promotions. In 1954, Turner and the Air Force intelligence report confirmed there was a strange craft. They were strange craft behaving in a manner suggestive of ET origin. Turner quoted Kehoe, but the Australian Air Force intelligence dismissed the whole thing. This is weird because there was solid data. There were eyewitness reports. This is evidence that, Bill Chalker, an Australian scientist and UFO researcher trained in mathematics and chemistry, was the first civilian researcher to gain access to the Royal Australian Air Force's UFO files in the early 1980s. He befriended Harry Turner. Now, Turner is an author. He befriended Turner later in his life, and he says of Turner's efforts, political myopia from both the U.S. and Australian military effectively scuttled Australia's first serious flirtation with a scientific investigation of the UFOs. So the military, political myopia of the military interfered with a public analysis of all of this. One area of test sighting called Maralinga saw many UFO sightings, including lights that got close, turned red, changed shape. They were determined to be UFOs, but later officially dismissed as static electricity. Many top brass were frustrated with the Air Force, who was dismissing eyewitnesses. And there were individuals in high levels of the military who were, what? What do you mean? There's nothing to see here. When the U.S. National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomenon began studies independent of Project Blue Book, many former military and intelligence officers supported the investigation. It was begun by inventor Thomas Townsend Brown, formerly of the CIA. Hillenkotter, remember him? He joined. Rear Admiral Delmer Farnay, former head of the Navy Guided Missile Program, became the chair of this group. These guys were so top. They'd be laughed at today, is what Ross says. People in their position today, if they came out with this stuff, they'd be ridiculed right out of their jobs. But these guys, that terrible backlash hadn't fully begun yet, and they believed the government was hiding something. They announced that there's nobody on Earth, no government, no military, known, that has the ability to do the speeds, acceleration, etc., like these UFOs, that they defy Newtonian physics. They also said many sightings are no longer reported to the Air Force because the Air Force does nothing and people are frustrated. Farney himself got secret reports from the Navy, including one of a giant craft swooping down on a squadron of aircraft training with a carrier, and they shot away at speed when approached by fighter planes. The Air Force officials came and told the pilots who had chased the UFOs, quote, "Forget what you saw today. You are not to discuss it with anyone." And that's proven. The U.S. Air Force aggressively debunked all of this publicly. Privately, they were still researching and took it very seriously and wanted to keep the lid on it and threatened anyone who wanted to talk about it. Hillenkotter pushed Congress. He pushed for congressional hearings. He was sent a memo by the U.S. Air Force Inspector General, and he released it to all the bases. He was told that UFOs are treated lightly by the press, and they must be identified as serious U.S. Air Force business. He told investigators to have a Geiger counter and to take samples. He was frustrated that the government was ignoring evidence, especially of multiple UFOs over sensitive military nuclear sites. Chapter 5, Hard Evidence. The U.S. government's public stand was, there's no threat. These are easy to explain away. Privately, there was an extraordinary amount of interest going on and substantial resources were being spent. This went way beyond Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book was the public facade. This was for show. There was stuff going on that was not known by the public. Before Project Blue Book got a case, it had to be vetted by a new group formed in 1953 called the Air Intelligence Service Squadron. All reports went to them first. They decided what to pass on to Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book would debunk them publicly, and all was well. But this Air Intelligence Service Squadron kept all the good stories. And they were also assigned the task of, wait for it, collecting UFOs. It's just mind-boggling. They ran this secret project. It was a quick reaction Air Force intelligence team that would go globally to any recovery site for objects, debris, or bodies. This was called Project Moondust, and it had a task memo. So this memo was found telling them what they were supposed to do. Locate and recover and deliver descended foreign space vehicles. So Operation Blue Fly, God, the military loves these stupid names. Operation Blue Fly was also supposed to deliver recovered stuff to the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson. Now, the Foreign Technology Division, ostensibly, allegedly, was studying Chinese things and Russian things, anything that we were worried about during the Cold War. They would study any confiscated material from our enemies. It's not what they were only up to. In 1990, by Howard Bloom, there was a book called Out There. and said that these foreign space vehicles included UFOs, not just Soviet, not just Chinese. Declassified Blue Book and Defense Intelligence Agency files agree with that assessment, that there was a covert UFO investigation and recovery program going on inside the government. And I think I'm going to say this is not specifically in this part of the book. I think he does mention it later, but Philip Corso mentioned it. Jesse Marcel mentioned it. I think Corso is the one who said he had UFO evidence material. Oh, excuse me, I'm getting the hiccups. In his filing cabinet in his office, and the guy down the hall knew nothing about any of it. It was 100% need to know, very compartmentalized. One hand didn't know what the other hand was doing, and still doesn't. And we'll talk later about trying to get clearance. Very difficult. Really important people cannot get clearance, even though they've struggled for a long time. And who's really running the show here? Well, he has some thoughts on that, which we will get to. So 1968, the CIA, this has a redacted document from the CIA from 1968. That says, it describes how a huge metallic disc-shaped object with a 6-foot base and 4 feet in height was found in a crater 8 kilometers northeast of Pokhara in Nepal. Portions of a similar object were found near other villages. There is nothing in the censored files to show if any object was ever recovered or what it was. Author and researcher Kevin Randall said U.S. Embassy staff were allowed to view 3 photographs of the recovered objects, but not a 4th photograph. Intriguingly, the subject of the message was again moon dust. The code name probably became too overt for the Air Force because in '87 the Air Force said Project Moondust no longer exists. It announced the name was replaced by another name that was still classified, and that of course suggests that Operation Moondust's successor continues. Arose by any other name, that somewhere out there someone is still quietly collecting UFO debris. Several sources have claimed to me, Ross, the author of the book, and other researchers that a secret collection unit using ex-military and intelligence experts still exists, but, this is your big clue about who's running this, that this operation is run through the cover of a group of U.S. aerospace corporations. Do you see how every book we read ties in? What did we read last week? Kings, psychopaths. Well, kings, conquerors, and psychopaths, but corporations, right? The modern day psychopath. Coulthart talked to Dr. Robert Jacobs. In 1964, he was told, the first lieutenant of a photo squad at Vandenberg Air Force Base, this Dr. Robert Jacobs. He was filming fake nuclear warhead tests, so they were empty, but they were going through the motions, when he caught pictures of an object flying around, and they're flying around the warhead and firing beams of light at the warhead. And he had no idea at the time, because they show his setup. He was in kind of a hood thing because of the ambient light and stuff. It's called a shroud. And he found it the next day on the film. He called the commanding officer and said, watch this. And they watched this UFO chase the warhead and shoot light at it, going 1,000 miles an hour, shooting beams at it. And the warhead fell. Excuse me. He had handed in his film. He didn't know what was on the film. They called him and said, come watch this. It's been a while since I read this. So he came into the office, and there's his boss with the film and 2 silent men in suits. They asked him, did you guys fool around with this film? He said, no, I haven't even looked at it. And they said to him, can you explain what we just saw? And he says, well, it's a UFO. And he was told, never say that again. This never happened. In 1982, he wrote about it in a magazine. A researcher tracked down the commanding officer, and the commanding officer confirmed this happened. He saw a domed disc on the film. The men at the filming were CIA classified top secret guys. So the commander told. He agreed it was a UFO. This is Dr. Jacobs. He now has a PhD in biomedical engineering and works at Stanford. No lunatic, right? And both said the UFO had superior technology. It sent a message by disabling the warhead and not using this for war was the message. Debunkers staged a vicious attack on them and tried to get Jacobs fired from his university job. And Ross says there was a coordinated effort inside the U.S. government to suppress this. April 24th, 1964. Oh, this is a famous case. Socorro, New Mexico. Lonnie Zamora, a cop, was driving down a deserted road in the desert and saw fire off the side of the road in the bush, and he was really concerned. Well, first he saw a flaming object in the sky, and then he saw the fire on the ground, and he thought a passenger plane had crashed. And he investigated only to discover a shiny white aluminum-like craft with two small people in coveralls standing outside of it. And as he approached them, they just got in and took off. He saw red lettering on the outside, and later they took pictures of dents in the ground where something had sat, something heavy, and charred brush. Other people, eyewitnesses, reported seeing the similar thing in the sky at the same time. The CIA files show the investigator, Hector Quintanilla, said that it was the best documented case on record he'd ever seen. This is a quote from the CIA investigator. Still open. I guess they haven't decided it was a weather balloon. December of 65 in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania was a crash and a huge military response. Witnesses saw acorn-shaped thing, 9 to 12 feet in diameter with a gold band around the bottom, and the band had writing on it like hieroglyphics. Project Blue Book said, it's a meteorite. Then they said, nah, it's a Russian and a U.S. satellite. And then they said, well, it's an open question. Witnesses said there was a retrieval, major military operation under extreme secrecy. People sneaked, in the woods to look. The United States was monitoring UFOs in Australia from their facilities. In 1965, the CIA has film from the Australian Air Force, from an aircraft belonging to the Australian Air Force. It was taken on a mapping flight over central Australia. They were taking pictures of the ground. They were creating maps, and they shows a huge hovering windowed craft with smaller craft on its tail. And the door on the side of this big craft opened up, and 3 small ones flew inside. The object canted at an angle and whoosh, was gone. April 6, 1966. This is a very famous story, and I do believe I covered this one Halloween. The Westall School incident. These children were at school. It was playground time for a lot of them, and some of them were still in classes. And the way the school was built, it had large windows that went very low so that the kids could daydream when they were bored. And they would look out the window and onto fields and stuff. And they saw saucers in the sky. If I remember correctly, and I think I do, the teachers were having a teacher conference during the break, and older kids were in charge of the younger kids on the playground. So the kids saw these saucers in the sky. This is one of the world's most witnessed UFOs. More than 100 children and teachers saw the same thing. They saw 3 hovering metal UFOs. A couple of the kids ran inside, teacher, and the teachers were like, what? And don't interrupt my class. And kids got up from their seats and people were just blown away. These things flew low. They hovered over an adjacent field. Several little girls ran after it and got close. And one of them has been interviewed recently. One of them was her family were recent immigrants from some Eastern European country, I think. This has been a while since I read this. He doesn't mention this in his book, but I've read it before in other books. And they were actually, they disappeared. They were relocated, I hope. The one that got the closest and saw the most. She went into shock. Anyway, this girl, who's now a woman, said, "I know what I saw. It was not a balloon. It was a machine, a craft. I could feel the heat coming off of it." She watched it tilt and lift off and fly away at incredible speed. They were warned in an assembly later that day by strange men in suits to not talk. When it happened, there was an immediate military response. Soldiers showed up. But then later that day, guys in suits warned them. And one of the teachers had a visit, one of the most vocal teachers had a visit from weird people who threatened to discredit him with threats of calling him out of the closet. In those days, that was a big deal. And he was part of the LGBTQ community. You didn't talk about it then. And they threatened to ruin him by going public with that if he said anything. Light planes seem to chase these things, the kids said. And two of them played cat and mouse with the planes. They were fluid, they were fast, and eventually they just tilted and flew off. The kids saw military and police digging where the UFO had landed, and they saw a big circle of flattened plants on the ground. And according to Ross, it does seem like there was an official cover-up. The military arrived, the assembly happened, they were told not to talk. One of the girls was put into some kind of witness protection. The teacher had 2 government agents come to the house and threaten him. The girls remember the military as some Australian and some American, and guys in black suits. Ross sent an invitation to all of the witnesses for the 55th anniversary in 2021. Talked to some of them. The government, he got a call, handwriting, got a call from a friend who was a very senior guy in the government for years and years and years, Ross did. And his friend told a story to him. His dad was a defense scientist. The friend's father was a defense scientist with the Federal Department of Supply in Melbourne. And his dad helped investigate this school flying saucer story. And his dad wrote a secret report. And days after the event, his father was picked up at home in a big black car and taken to the site every single day. He heard his parents whispering at night, kind of serious. And he didn't know the details, but he said his dad was shocked and rattled. And no documents of any of this were ever found. So Ross spoke to witnesses, and they're all contemptuous of the attempts to call this thing a balloon. You know, we may have been kids, but we know what we saw. The craft was under intelligent control. It was dodging the planes. It was toying with them, and there has never been an official explanation. Researcher Shane Ryan spoke with 171 witnesses of this event. They saw saucers, and they saw the circle in the grass, and they saw intense military activity. He has drawings by one kid who was close enough to touch the saucer. This happened in broad daylight, and it was absolutely a physical thing. Broad daylight, it was clear sky. It was in the suburb of a major city, seen by a huge number of people, over 200 people. Ross says, what, there's no documentation? Why wasn't this investigated? What? Ryan confirms that witnesses were warned and threatened not to talk as children, and that's pretty effective with little kids. Residents saw a layer of dirt from the landing site being dug up and trucked out by military. January 1966 in Queensland, a place called Tully. A farmer by the name of George Pedley heard hissing and saw a light gray saucer that rose up and shot away from a field. He took photos, and it showed what later were termed tully nests, where the grass was flattened and reeds in the swamp were uprooted. The Air Force does not even address this sighting. They called it a whirling mass of tropical air. I'm sorry, I can't take this seriously. Just a little wind. Is this an active attempt at a cover-up, Ross asks. Well, maybe they're just not able to admit that they don't know what it is. They can't prevent it. They can't protect anybody. They're afraid to say anything, which to my mind is basically covering it up. So he says it's still frequently seen today. These things are still frequently seen today by a senior Australian military intelligence insider tells him that they're still getting reports, and they're especially happening over the super secret Pine Gap U.S. Australian base near Alice Springs. This is a really important secret base. Once they used to be sure this, was certainly Cold War enemies, and then they were able to prove that it wasn't, not Chinese, not Russian. And they just decided, okay, and they ignored them. But surely, Ross says, surely this needs explanation. This is a threat. And he says, is this kind of fake nonchalance part of the cover-up to just act insouciant about, a big story that they're taking seriously? Several agencies in the United States have been most active in shutting down stories in public interest. The Condon Report had a debunking agenda in 1968 and said that nothing has come from a 2-year study of these claimed UFO activities. And this gave the Air Force an excuse to close Project Blue Book in 1969. Hynek said, science has spoken. There are no UFOs. All the eyewitnesses, they're deluded. They're hoaxers. They're nuts. Never mind they work at nuclear facilities. Never mind they're fighter pilots. No big deal. Or astronauts. So was this just to shut down the public interest? Oh, I don't know. What do you think? 1985, the Air Force again said, no reason to pursue this. And this is lies, because reports have been uncovered that seem to indicate that they're a security threat and it's kept secret, and investigations have never stopped. So, Chapter 6, Cracking the Cover-Up. According to Ross, the cover-up continued into the 70s with the Cold War, and sightings kept happening globally, and it was kept a global secret. Harry Turner, the author, who was ignored in 1954 when he said that these guys were ETs, was now, wait for it, the head of nuclear science at the Australian Joint Intelligence Bureau. And he was really pushing the Australian Defence Department to investigate. He claimed officials had the policy of ridicule to stifle public awareness of a real phenomenon. He said they wanted to allay public alarm and decrease the possibility of the Soviets using it as a psyop or for real war, and keep the rumors going as a cover for U.S. experiments in technology. Project Blue Book was created to debunk while the U.S. government was working on anti-gravity devices. And he eviscerated the Condon Report. He discredited their lies and their debunking. He said many intelligence officers, including Hillenkotter, confirmed that U.S. military and government officials know that UFOs are off-planet. Let's put it that way. And that they're withholding the fact. And Hillenkotter met with Hynek and agreed that many reputable scientists don't accept the U.S. Air Force's explanations. Turner, the author, advocated Australians' rapid response team and investigation, keep at it. Defense scientists agreed, but intelligence officers were pissed off that he'd criticized them, and so they withdrew access to their files. He advocated more investigations, and he advocated for more money to support them. But the Air Force took all of this as a criticism of what they were doing and took offense. And then we have more incidents. In October of 73, during the Yom Kippur War, as the Soviets were threatening to get involved with Israel, Kissinger put the U.S. on DEFCON 3, the highest peacetime alert, because of the situation in the Middle East. The forces were on alert, and some were deployed in Australia, back at the Northwest Cape, where the signals were sent for the nuclear subs in the Indian Ocean, and where UFOs were seen by the woman at the party at the very beginning, and two Australian security cops, and which was 100% a target for U.S. enemies in a nuclear war. So while Kissinger was preparing for an escalation for a nuclear confrontation with Russia, a U.S. Navy fire captain, now he was an Australian working as a subcontractor for the U.S. Navy, one of two witnesses to an object hovering over the Northwest Australian base, a large black sphere with revolving pulsating halo at the center of it. They watched it for 4 minutes and then it sped off. This also, just coincidentally, was seen by U.S. Lieutenant Commander Moyer. So he was driving south, closer to the base, and he saw it too. And he could think of no conventional explanation. Bill Lynn, who died in 1995, told his son that his dad claimed that this was swept under the rug to keep it from the public. This officer tried to tell Lynn that he saw a flock of birds. This is the firefighter, the Australian firefighter. I read this book I really went through this book fast because I really wanted to cover it in a timely fashion because of these committee hearings. And sometimes I forgot to write things down. I thought I'd already written them down. They were in my head. So the name of this firefighter was Bill Lynn. And his son said that his dad claimed that the whole thing was swept under the rug, and he was told by officials to claim, oh, I saw a flock of birds. He had drawn a sketch of it on a scrap of paper on the hood of the car that night. I mean, he saw it and pulled out a piece of paper right there, drew what he'd seen. There's no record of any of this. All the original files are lost. Later, an NSA officer, under oath, had to admit that 239 UFO documents existed in the files. There's a clear link between the United States and Australia UFO sightings over sensitive sites, especially Pine Gap, one of the most important nuclear sites in the world. And this was confirmed to Ross, the author of this book, by insiders. And he's very clear to say he has insiders and they're legitimate, and it shook him to the core to hear these people who had a lot of responsibility, very stable, very educated people who had a lot to lose, telling him this. But because of non-disclosure agreements or oaths, security oaths, they weren't in a position to go public, but they told him under cover of anonymity, and he says it's his ethical responsibility to protect them, but it shook him to the core. See here. 3 years later, Jimmy Carter, was elected. He was a liberal, and he'd claimed that he'd seen UFOs. So he hoped that he'd get disclosure. The Canadian researcher, Grant Cameron, really interesting guy, talked to Carter. And he said, Carter was really interested in this, but his efforts were stymied every direction he went. He'd seen a UFO. He'd promised to open the files to the public. He met with Bush Sr. and the CIA, and they all refused. Carter asked Congress Research Service specialist Marcia Smith to look into it. She asked civil rights lawyer Daniel Sheehan to ask the Vatican to go through their archive. the Vatican, and the Vatican refused. The Pentagon Papers, okay, this guy, Daniel Sheehan, is a lawyer. He worked on the Pentagon Papers. He worked with Karen Silkwood, 3 Mile Island. These are all cases that he worked on. He worked with Jesuits he defended John Mack. So he's always been willing to take on these really hard cases. And that's why they asked him to approach the Vatican, because the Jesuits knew him. Then Marcia Smith tried to get him a tour to lobby Congress with NASA astronauts that were pushing for money for SETI. This is the Society for Extraterrestrial Investigation that sends signals out into space looking for a response. He was able to get some more money for SETI. And as a kind of an aside, he was asked to speak at NASA. So he agreed, but he asked to view the Blue Book files, and they actually allowed him. He had built some trust. But it was all very cloak and dagger, intense security. He couldn't bring his briefcase in. He wasn't allowed to take notes. The room had boxes of microfiche and too many to read, and he actually saw pictures of UFOs. There was a saucer crashed into a snowbank with the Air Force all standing around and symbols like a foreign language on the craft. He left with no real information because he couldn't take anything out. It was just an overwhelming flood of stuff. But he was 100% sure the government was hiding information from the public. He worked with the 2001 National Press Club Disclosure Project. He says now that he thinks the public is being prepared for a sanitized version of all of this. And later on in the book, we get into it. It's a very interesting debate. After 1940 and the craft retrieval, the U.S. security state set up a program to discredit anyone and to destroy lives if need be, and people died, allegedly. So because of the Cold War, they wanted to keep alien technology for themselves and away from enemies. Marcia Smith would not talk with Ross. So in Cover Up Exposed, Richard Dolan, another investigator who's just got fascinating stuff, dug up the fact that Carter got 2 classified reports. One said there were some unexplained sightings, and another said the U.S. Air Force could not rule out ETs, but there were no pictures. They didn't show him anything that the lawyer Sheehan saw. We don't really know what any president ever found out. Carter refused to talk to Ross, and he got more stonewalling. The conclusion was that it's even kept away from the president. So the question is, who has enough power to do that? And we do get into it later, and it's really mind-boggling. So Sheehan challenged the government. He said, call me a liar. Go ahead. He went public with all of this. He said, call me a liar. And there was no response, public response. July of 1977, the Carter science advisor asked NASA to investigate public inquiries about UFOs, and he was told no. He didn't explain the pictures that Sheehan claimed he saw. He wouldn't discuss UFO sightings over Australian nuclear facilities, despite multiple witnesses from both countries. So there we are. Chapter 7, Confusion or Cover-Up. The government said that was investigating... The government said that the investigation that they had was shut down, Project Blue Book. And this is categorically not true. The U.S. has continued to take a very close interest in all of this. There's been intense official investigation of many events since the 70s. For example, Wellington Airport, New Zealand, December of 1978. John Cordy was working Christmas night. He was an air traffic controller. He saw a UFO on radar. He says, and I quote, "We know what we saw." The Air Force claims that they interviewed all the witnesses, and Cordy said, well, that's baloney, because no one ever talked to me, and he was the head guy on the radar. He's bitter that the Air Force told them that they were mistaken. He's very bitter about that. An Argosy pilot also saw objects moving around him, and they tracked him for 40 miles, and the object followed him and was also on radar. The Air Force said the radar was faulty. But nobody interviewed Cordy, the radar operator. He says the radar was fine. Ross Young, a newspaper reporter, saw many public letters, many angry public letters about a cover-up of what they saw or what they believed didn't happen. The objects were filmed by a journalist on a plane. He was ridiculed his whole life. Other journalists on the plane kept notes during the flight. They all saw the object. They were tracked by tower plane radar. There are audio tapes from the cockpit of the airplane to the tower. And they have not been heard. They've not been made public. And the guy was interviewed, but that was it. In 1980 at Rendlesham Forest, this is the Bentwaters Woodbridge. There's in Rendlesham Forest, by Rendlesham Forest in England, there's a joint base side by side. Half of it is the American base, Bentwaters, and the other side is the RAF, Royal Air Force Base, Woodbridge, and they share things and they work in tandem. And it's a great book, Left at East Gate, and members of the military came out and talked about it, interviewed about it, and what happened. I won't go into it here much, but oh wow, it's fascinating. And I did cover it, so you can find that video. So these parallel bases were both reported on two separate sets of radar, English and American. The object landed in the forest. It was seen by military personnel on radar and by pilots. The military guys in the jeeps who do the perimeter investigated it and had lost time. Peniston and Burroughs were their names. They touched the craft, and then one of them got really sick. They saw hieroglyphics on the craft. Nick Pope, the Ministry of Defense's, he was the ufology guy, says there was very high radiation in the area. Now, this was all around Christmas time, and they had a big employee base Christmas party, and all the big brass were there 2 nights later. And the Air Force Colonel Holt, the guy in charge, well, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And he left the party and went to the site of the second landing, and he wrote detailed memos. This is the head of this Air Force base. Detailed memos about the whole thing. Ross interviewed Holt in 2009 for a television documentary. He told me he and his colleagues witnessed a hovering UFO in the forest at close range, and he believed the vehicle was probably extraterrestrial. This is the guy in charge of the Air Force Base. Holt's an intelligent man with excellent recall, just the sort of stable character whom you would put in charge of a base that held top secret nuclear weapons. As the entire event unfolded that night, he had the presence of mind to audio tape his dramatic live commentary of what he saw, including how the objects looked like an eye winking at you. In a field, he and his patrol watched as the object, which had danced about in the forest, shed sparks that looked like molten metal. There was a heavy field of static electricity in the air, and perhaps most disturbingly, it shone beams of light into the nuclear weapons storage area on the base. Skeptics say, you guys, you're confused. You saw a lighthouse. There is a lighthouse in the distance from the base. You just saw the lighthouse. Holt said that this thing was, he saw a craft. He stood next to a craft. He said it was under intelligent control, and he's convinced there's a cover-up. Margaret Thatcher is quoted as saying, you can't tell the people about this. And at the same time, happening exactly at the same time, a UFO similar was spotted at Dayton, Texas. 2 women and a child pulled a car over and got out to witness a huge diamond-shaped UFO with heat and radiation. It softened their dashboard. At least 23 helicopters followed in formation. Now remember that because we're going to talk about this again later. It becomes important. 23 military helicopters followed this diamond-shaped UFO. Days later, the women had blisters on their skin and their hair fell out. A radiologist diagnosed all three of them with an injury from ionizing radiation. They sued the government, but it was dismissed. November of '86, pilots from a Japanese Airlines plane saw two UFOs and a larger mothership near Anchorage, Alaska. The whole crew was adamant that the craft had speeds and abilities that were not of this earth. They could go very, very fast and stop in midair. That would kill a person. This was seen on radar, confirmed on radar, and the FAA said, oh, it was just clutter. I must have UFOs in my closet then. The debunkers called it, it's atmospheric phenomena. So there's evidence of a cover-up. There was a secret meeting between the FAA and the CIA. They confiscated the radar readouts. The CIA ordered everybody to deny this meeting happened, and they were told you would panic the American people. You cannot talk about this. A guy called Callahan, an officer of the FAA, kept a video of the radar air traffic control voice communication and the papers, and he gave all of it to Dr. Stephen Greer. It 100% supports the pilot's story. Quote, I saw a UFO chase a Japanese 747 across the sky for half an hour on radar, end quote. Back in Northwest Cape Base, Australia, they're busy over there. In 1987, two officers made a report that while preparing a drop zone for parachutists who were going to be coming later, they saw a huge glowing light that zigzagged. It hovered over the airport. It kept changing colors. Then it rose slowly and then shot out of sight. At the same time, their radios lost communication with the transport aircraft they were preparing the site for that had the parachutists in it. An investigating major confirmed there were three radios, three different places, could not reach the plane, and that the only time communication was lost in the 6 days of their parachute jump things. This was the only time. The pilots of the aircraft saw it too, but they didn't report it. Ross says that many pilots tell him that they would never report all the things they've seen. And especially if they work for a commercial airline, they'll lose their position as a pilot. As the USSR collapsed, many similar stories leaked out, finally. It was hard to get information from Russia before that, including an incident near Finland, 1977, when more than 170 military, cops, and scientists saw a UFO and all of their communication went out. Also, they were seen around rocket launchers and test sites. George Knapp, a TV reporter, coast to coast, interviewed Russian military that were investigating these UFOs, and he was told the UFOs were flying over Russian nuclear facilities, that they flew over missiles that were winding up to launch without authority. So they were winding the missiles up to launch, but then they would suddenly stop, and the humans had no control. These are nuclear missiles. Yeah. Soviet pilots were killed by UFOs. At least 40 Soviet pilots were killed by UFOs. This is documented. Their policy was chase them and shoot at them. It wasn't American. Americans were a little bit smarter, I think. So what would happen is they'd try to keep up, and they'd go so fast that their planes, Soviet planes, couldn't keep up, and they crashed. Chapter 8, the Black Triangles. In 1989, huge black triangles were spotted over Belgium and Germany. Just a huge number of witnesses of all kinds, but including military, air traffic controls, pilots, police, just everybody. They were tracked on multiple radars. They were chased by jets. This is called the Belgian Wave, and it went on from November 89 to April of 90. Rumors were, it must be the U.S. They did extraordinary maneuvers, hovering at a standstill and then disappearing and no sound. Witnesses insisted it was a solid craft with intelligence guidance, and this included Belgian Air Staff Colonel and Deputy Chief of the Belgian Air Force. All saw it. They told all about this at a Washington, D.C. press conference. They said hundreds saw a 120-foot wide minimum triangle hover and then disappear at very high speeds, just shoot up. And they saw many sightings like this for months. 2 F-16s could not keep up. This thing had capabilities far beyond any Air Force. The director of the military infrastructure for Belgian Army, Colonel Amund, and his wife saw it, and the U.S. denied the whole thing. So this is the head of the military infrastructure for the Belgian Army. Some of these witnesses are pretty sterling. So Amund was adamant that what he saw was an unknown aerial vehicle, an intelligently guided craft displaying a technology far beyond the public known aerospace technological capacities of any nation. He was one of 143 witnesses to provide a statement, many of whom provided detailed drawings, photographs, and videos of the strange craft that they saw. The U.S. denied the whole thing, and it's unexplained to this day. They were also seen over a base in, where? Northwest Cape, Australia, in June of 1990. A former soldier who was on night patrol at the time saw a huge hovering triangle 2 football fields wide. I'm never sure how big that is. I don't really know. How would you know? It scared the S out of me, he's quoted as saying, and my patrol. It had 8 lights, a low hum, very low hum. It hovered, and it abruptly went out over the sea and shot up into the sky. There were sightings by French Air Force pilots. They were standing outside a gym, and they were talking, friends, 6 of them. And he said, this one said, it's like a city floating through the clouds. At the same time, English jets encountered the object over the North Sea. It overtook them at unimaginable speed. The Ministry of Defense for England, that's like their Department of Defense, said, oh, well, maybe it's a stealth bomber. In March of 93, there were a wave of sightings over England, and Nick Pope related all about this after he left office. He couldn't talk about it while he was in office. He was the official UFO guy for the English, and they eventually got rid of the department. He knew too much. This was seen by RAF, by police, a huge diamond over them. Pope said, there's no such thing as a perfect witness. But when it's Air Force professionals, you pay attention. Yet another sighting happened in a different area of England on the same night, and Pope had to say, hang on. Pope was forced to say publicly they were of no defense significance, but he said later, clearly, I knew that was nonsense. Christopher Mellon. Now, this guy's famous, the Mellon family, He was a staffer to U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He was an assistant to Senator Cohen, later the Defense Secretary. Mellon became the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, the 3rd highest intelligence position in the Pentagon. So this guy, big shot. And after much investigation, he said, well, the U.S. doesn't have a triangle flying program. That's just not a thing. So it wasn't the U.S. What the Belgians saw was not U.S., and then he went on to say it did not have human capabilities. It had more than. Mellon has very high clearance, and he's willing to talk. It's very unusual. It's unusual, but, the guy's so rich. Part of his job, his official job, is to monitor Area 51. And this wasn't even acknowledged as an area until 2013. It's a top secret Air Force aerospace area. Lots of stories of strange objects and lights. hovering objects, secret tests of experimental craft. His job was to investigate the Aurora project, a secret aircraft, a super stealth aircraft. And there are speculations that, is it anti-gravity? And I'm not saying that the U.S. has anti-gravity. These are speculations. Mellon toured Area 51, and he said there's nothing there that could behave the way these objects behave in the sky. He says, and there are no so-called alien craft at Area 51. But it's not impossible because the area is so big and so much of it is so secret that anything could be stashed there. Any program could be going on there. You know, you can't dismiss it. Mellon's job was to expose the dirty secrets of he was obsessed with UFOs since he was a child, and he hoped to find something. And he went into it wanting to prove it, and he said he couldn't prove a negative. You can't prove something doesn't exist. Ben Rich of Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works. Now, Skunk Works is a kind of a secret. The name is not secret, but the department is secret. It does all kinds of experimental, secret plane aeronautical stuff. He hinted at advanced technology in a speech once that would be 50 years beyond what we could imagine. And he showed a quick film of something going into space and said it worked on ESP. He says all points are connected in time and space. So here we go. Physics, metaphysics, boom. Could Rich have been putting out disinformation? Well, of course he could, but it depends on your point of view, right? There's no doubt that there's something very advanced technology, and it's flying about, and we don't know who made it. It's there, it's documented, nobody knows who made it, supposedly. Reports of UFOs have happened over Okinawa, seen by Air Force colonels in the most advanced plane. And the UFO was far more advanced than the most advanced plane. They clocked it at over 8,000 miles an hour, and that's as high as they could measure. Faster jets today, now this was a while back, and faster jets today can only go about a quarter of that speed. Bob Lazar, we did his book. He was a physicist and a whistleblower about Area 51 reverse engineering of UFOs. At one point, he was a huge skeptic, and then he got this job and he became a believer. He worked at Site S4. He got on a 737 every morning in Las Vegas and was flown to this secret site at Area 51. And he claims that when he went public, Men in Black wiped his educational record off the books and all of his former employment at Los Alamos National Lab. But interestingly, they didn't realize that a funny little local paper had done an old news story about Los Alamos Lab, and he happened to be in the picture. So he did work there. His claims were real, and they just missed it, which is interesting. He was accused of running a prostitution ring. Discrediting him? Is it true? Ross says, I don't know, but it's a common smear tactic that's used to discredit people who are talking too much. Was he authentic? Hard to say. And if we remember when we did his book, his claim was they came in and they put a black box in front of him and they said, figure out how that works. And this is supposedly like the propulsion or the engine or something for a UFO that runs with the pilot in a special chair and his telepathy run the thing. I don't know. 1991, a U.S. satellite tracked mysterious objects coming from outer space into our airspace. They were tracked by Pine Gap, the very top secret place that's Australian and American, and it does electronic and space communication. It collects satellite data. It often detects UFOs. They have a name for them. They see them so often they call them fast walkers. But all the staff is under secret oath, security oath. In 2015, Assange did a WikiLeaks thing of Podesta emails about UFOs, if you remember that whole hoo-ha. Emails that said UFOs were routinely detected entering the atmosphere from deep space. He was told that UFO hunters are looking in the wrong place. What we see relies on the viewer's state of mind. Here we go with the metaphysics again. That the real proof is in hard science data from advanced, reliable instruments. The email is about Air Force pilots that were diverted to track UFOs off the Florida coast. They were landing and taking off, the UFOs were landing and taking off from the ocean east of Miami and north of Bermuda. They were filmed and they could be tracked by a unique electronic signal that they gave off. Ross talked with the source of the emails to Podesta. It's a defense intelligence insider named Mr. Fish, and he worked on secret programs, including nuclear missile threats from the USSR. There's stuff he can't talk about, but if he told about the signal and the enemies, if he told more specifics, the enemies that we have could copy that signal, put it in a bomb, and we wouldn't know. He says we need truth without endangering our security. Ross notes that Fish implies that there is a truth to be revealed. Fish knew of the radar that tracked these things, the film of it, the audio of it, the signals they let off, the eyewitnesses, and the fact that there was no government reaction. Dick D'Amato is a lawyer to to the Senate Appropriations Committee, and he found $75 billion in a black budget to U.S. national security. He complained to Jacques Vallée of intelligence communities' cover-ups. They behave as if they ran the country. What they are doing is a felony, and Congress needs to know. And we're going to get into this, and it's really, really interesting and really, really alarming. The government can't spend appropriated money on projects the Congress doesn't know about. That raises the question, would the president be told the truth? Worse, it raises the question of who is running the country. Worse, if the men who sit in this chamber cannot find out the committee about such a project, we are no longer in a democracy. Whatever that secret project, it must be controlled by an incredible level of fear because nobody dares to talk about it. I find no leaks anywhere. This is D'Amato. 30 years ago, D'Amato had reportedly tried to expose what he believed was a UFO cover-up. Ross wrote to the now elderly Richard D'Amato, but he never heard back. D'Amato has obviously had a lot of folks chasing him for further comment because on his website, a statement says that after his investigation for Senator Byrd, he recommended to the senator that the allegations about UFO crashes did not appear to merit any further Senate investigation, whatever the assertion applies. It did not exclude the possibility that D'Amato's suspicions were validated. Perhaps somebody told him to pull his head in. Ross wonders, could they possibly keep this secret? What if the president, the Congress, and the people were lied to by aerospace corporations that had invented this technology? A cabal of corporation cronies with a few rogue generals away from pesky government accountability. Is that possible? And that's the end of that particular chapter, and we will begin the next chapter in the next video. So thank you for watching, and I'll be back soon. It's long of oil.